But here's the problem. If you don't have Mecca in the right place, then what are you going to do with the Kiblat? See, the Kiblat is the direction of prayer. Every Muslim knows exactly where to pray every day, 5 times a day. Doesn't matter where they are in the world, they always pray towards Mecca. Am I correct on that? The Qibla is sacrosanct. Every mosque you go into, you'll see a mihrab. It's designed, it is pointing towards Mecca. I was on the airplane there with Malaysian Airlines before it got shot down. And as we were flying across the waters, we could see on a television screen the Qibla change as we were moving. So any Muslim could get up off their seat and do the prayer at any time in the right direction. So that's why the Qibla is absolutely important, because we do know that the Qibla has always been directed towards Mecca since 624. According to the Quran, in Surah 2, Ayah 143, it says very clearly that the Qibla was pointed towards Mecca since 624. You want to find where the Qibla is today, you can go and get these apps on your phone. That's my hotel room there in Kuala Lumpur, and there you can see where the Qibla was on my hotel room. Surah 2, 134, 43, 145 gives the direction of Qibla as Mecca. Now, back in 1905, Dr. Fehervadi and Dr. Creswell were actually going through that part of the world looking for the oldest mosques they could find and digging down to the original floor plans. They went to the Wasit Mosque and the Kufa Mosque, which is in today Iraq. And they went into the Fustat Mosque, which is just outside of Egypt, outside of Cairo in Egypt. When they dug down to the original floor plans of both the Wasit and the Kufa Mosque, they noticed the Qibla was facing straight west. It should have been facing south. When they went to Fustat, they noticed it was facing straight east. It should have been facing southeast. There's Wasit, there's Kufa, there's Fustat. They were all facing this way. They thought in 1905 that they were facing Jerusalem. They were wrong. They were off by 3 to 5 degrees. We can't blame them. That's pretty close. Nonetheless, why were they facing that direction? Well, Dr. Dan Gibson wanted to find this out. Now, he'd been living in the Arabian Peninsula. He'd been there for 20 years. His father was an archaeologist. His grandfather was an archaeologist. So he wanted to find out, what can we do with this Qibla? But he was there, learned the language, and he moved all over the Middle East and decided to take pictures from space using satellite technology onto the original Qiblas, because many of the mosques today have been destroyed and rebuilt many times. So he wanted to look to the original floor plans. By doing that, he needed to find where the original enclosures are. You can only do that from space. Look what he found. The Great Mosque in Guangzhou in China, built 630. Look where it's facing. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. The Humayma Mosque in Jordan, it's facing Petra, almost completely opposite from Mecca. The Great Mosque of Baalbek in Lebanon, it's facing Petra, not Mecca. The Great Mosque of Sana'a, now we're in Yemen. Look at the date, 705. Muhammad died in 632. The Qibla was canonized in 624. So now we're a good 75 years later. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, this is interesting because there you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque and there you have the Dome of the Rock. The entire citadel, including the Dome of the Rock, built in 691. The Al-Aqsa Mosque built in 709. All of them, the citadel, the Dome of the Rock, and Al-Aqsa Mosque are all facing Petra. And they're still facing Petra today. They're not facing Mecca. The Damascus Mosque built in 709, it's facing Petra, not Mecca. The Anjan Mosque in Lebanon in 714, look at the date now, it's facing Petra, not Mecca. The mosque in Umar Basra in Syria, 720, now we're almost 100 years later, it's facing Petra, not Mecca. As far away as Banbur, finally a mosque in Pakistan is finally facing Mecca in 727. That's the first mosque he could find that finally had the Qibla right. But then the very next year, he found one in Syria that was neither facing Petra or Mecca. They were a little confused there. Now, this is interesting. Here's the older mosque built in 700 in Amman in Jordan. It's facing Petra. That's built in 700. Look at this mosque here. This is built in 740. It's finally facing Mecca. What happened between 700 and 740? The new mosque is right. The old mosque is incorrect. Something happened between those years. We'll get to that. Back in 743 then, here's another mosque facing back to Petra again. So there's still not uniformity. Now, when he got to North Africa, the mosques were not facing Petra or Mecca. They were all completely confused in North Africa. Here's one in Tunisia. It's facing this direction. It's not facing Petra or Mecca. The same way here in Spain, it's facing here. It should be facing those directions. And the same way in Tunisia. Here's another one. The Qibla's this way. We're not sure yet why. They're completely confused in North Africa. Take a look at where all the Qiblas were facing. Every Qibla, uniformly, were facing Petra. They weren't off by any degrees. Didn't matter how far away they were, even as far as Guangzhou in China, they were all facing Petra. And he noticed that every mosque up until 725 were facing Petra. Between 725 and 822, 12% were facing Petra, 50% were facing Mecca, 38 were point parallel. It wasn't until 822 that all the mosques began to face Mecca. That's 200 years too late. Now, why haven't we been told this? You can see, this is the secret Muslims don't want us to know. Can you see the problems we're dealing with here? Why were they facing Petra? There's Petra right up here. Look and see what it is. It's the center of all the trade. It's the center of the Nabatean kingdom. The Nabatean, Petra is where the tombs and temples of the Nabateans were. The Nabateans are the people that give us Arabic. The Arabic script comes from the Nabatean script. The name Allah is a Nabatean god, Ilaha. Ilaha has a wife named Alat, whose formal name is Al-Uzza. Now, any of you who know exactly what I've just said, Alat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, these are the three goddesses. Interestingly, they're not daughters at all. Alat and Al-Uzza is the wife of Allah, which means Allah has a wife. I had no idea. I always thought Allah was one. Surah 6, Ayah 101 says Allah cannot have a consort. Well, then they shouldn't have used Allah, because they've got the wrong God. This is a Nabatean God who has a Nabatean wife, which means this is a pagan God, a polytheistic God, which has nothing to do with the God we see in our Bible. Can you now see, historically, we're now destroying Allah today, but that's not for this lecture, that's for another lecture. Just to show you what we now know about what we're finding out about the Nabatean era and what we now know about Petra. Guess where the black stone comes from? The black stone that is in the Kaaba today comes from Petra. And it's referred to. Up until the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, it was always the stone that people went to worship. No wonder it's in the Kaaba in Mecca. Take a look. Petra is in a valley. Petra has a parallel valley. Petra has a stream going through it. It has fields, trees, grass, clay, loam. It has olive trees. It is near the pillar of salt. If there was ever any pillar of salt, it would be up near Petra. Petra has all the items listed above from the Quran and the Islamic traditions. Thus, could Petra be the place they are referring to? Take a look also. Where do you think Ad, Thamud, and Midian are? Ad, Thamud, and Midian, they're referred to 23, 24, and 7 times. These are the tribes all around Petra. But that's 600 miles too far north. Can you see? Something's wrong with the Quran. It's 600 miles from where it should be. So therefore, we know nothing about Muhammad until the late 7th century. We don't have his biography until the 9th century. His city doesn't even refer to until the 8th century. Thus, much of what we know Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. It looks like he is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly by Abdul Malik. Hold that name. You'll see why that's important. So the conclusion, Islam and the Prophet's life as we know it was not derived from the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years and then redacted back to the Prophet's life and compiled in the 9th century.